Why did her hand stop shaking the moment she stepped outside, even though her entire life had just been erased behind her? Grace Donnelly didn't cry when the cafe door closed behind her, not because she wasn't hurt, but because shock has a way of numbing pain until it decides you're ready to feel it. The morning sun felt too bright, almost disrespectful as it spilled across the sidewalk. Her apron was folded neatly under her arm, her fingers still remembering the rhythm of service. 6 years. 6 years of early mornings, burnt pots of coffee, and listening more than speaking. All gone because she chose dignity over compliance. She walked toward her truck slowly, aware of every sound. The bell inside the cafe still echoing faintly, a spoon clattering, someone whispering her name. Grace didn't look back. If she did, she might have broken. And she had promised herself something long ago, standing at a graveside in Arlington, that she would not let grief turn her into someone who looked away. Inside the cafe, the silence felt wrong. Ray McMillan sat frozen, his coffee untouched. Shadow remained at his feet, alert but calm, trained not to react even when the world did. Ray's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in shame. Shame that yet again someone had paid a price for standing beside him. Grace hadn't asked questions. She never did. She'd simply seen him. What no one knew, not Grace, not Ray, not even the inspector gripping his clipboard, was that someone near the window had raised a phone. Not dramatically, not for attention, just instinctively, because something about that moment felt like it shouldn't be forgotten. And somewhere miles away, inside a quiet office lined with photographs of young men who never made it home, a Marine colonel's phone was about to ring. Grace sat in her truck with the engine off, staring at the steering wheel like it had answers. Her chest felt hollow now. The numbness was wearing thin. She thought of Michael, of the last morning they'd shared coffee before his deployment, of how he joked that one day she'd run a place that mattered more than any command post. She laughed then. Now the memory burned. Her phone buzzed once, unknown number. She didn't answer. She drove home instead, unaware that 4 Humvees had just turned onto Main Street. What does authority look like when it doesn't raise its voice? The rumble reached the cafe before the vehicles came into view. At first it sounded like thunder, low, steady, impossible to ignore. Cups rattled. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the windows just as the first Humvee rolled into the lot, then the second, then 2 more, moving with deliberate calm. Marines stepped out in unison. Full-dress blues. No one inside breathed. Colonel Richard Gaines adjusted his gloves once before entering. He didn't scan the room for dominance. He didn't need to. His presence carried weight because it carried memory. He'd been 23 once, bleeding in a dust-filled ravine overseas, kept alive by a corporal who never made it home. He'd learned then that rules matter, but humanity matters more. His eyes found Ray immediately. Ray stood stiff but steady. They nodded to each other, no words, none needed. When Gaines spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Where is Grace Donnelly?" Lena swallowed before answering. She was fired for doing the right thing. That was all it took. Outside, Marines moved with purpose, not aggression. They removed corporate signage like it was a flag folded at a funeral, replaced it with something handwritten, something human. Inside, the inspector's clipboard hung useless at his side. "You don't need to know someone's rank to treat them with dignity," Gaines said quietly. "You just need to remember they're human." And somewhere across town, Grace's phone rang again. This time she answered. What do you do when purpose knocks after you've lost everything? Grace stood at the gates of Fort Granger feeling small again. Not unwelcome, just unsure. She hadn't worn this feeling since Michael's memorial. Being close to the base had once felt like home. Now it felt like a test. Colonel Gaines didn't waste time. He showed her empty rooms, folding chairs, whiteboards with erased ideas, programs that failed not because they were wrong, but because they lacked soul. "You built a sanctuary without calling it one," he told her. We need that here." Grace wanted to say no. She wanted to go home, sit in silence, and mourn what she'd lost. But then she saw Tiffany, burned scars hidden beneath sleeves, eyes guarded, a service dog in training at her side. A woman who hadn't stepped into a cafe in months but had watched Grace's stand online and thought, maybe I could exist there. That was the moment Grace understood. This wasn't about a job. It was a mission. And missions don't always come with uniforms. Some days later, as Grace pinned Michael's photo to the wall of a still-empty center, she felt something unfamiliar stir. Not joy, not pride. Purpose. What happens when healing doesn't look like progress, but presence? The center grew quietly. No press releases, no speeches, just coffee brewing and chairs filled slowly. Grace listened. That was her skill. She didn't interrupt pain, she made room for it. Auditors came. Skeptics questioned her credentials. She answered honestly. "I don't fix people," she said. "I stay." Some nodded, some didn't. But veterans came back, again and again. Ray, Tiffany, others who'd forgotten how to sit without scanning exits. And slowly something shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. What does recognition mean to someone who never asked for it? The letter arrived sealed in gold. Grace read it twice, then laughed softly, disbelief mixing with humility. A civilian commendation, a speech, Washington. She brought only what mattered: Michael's watch, her notebook, the weight of every name she'd ever remembered. At the podium, her voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. "I served coffee," she said, "and I listened." The room leaned in. Because sometimes truth doesn't need volume, it needs space. Later, a man with white hair handed her an old photograph, a moment she'd forgotten, a kindness she'd never known mattered. She cried then, quietly. What remains when the noise fades? Back home, Grace added one more photo to the wall, not of awards, not of applause, but of a crowded cafe, dogs under tables, coffee in every hand. Legacy, she'd learned, wasn't built through recognition. It was built through consistency, through choosing to act when silence was easier. Grace Donnelly never wore a uniform, but she served. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the room feel smaller the moment the inspector pointed at the dog, like the walls themselves were holding their breath? Grace noticed it before anyone spoke, that subtle tightening in the air, conversations thinning out, chairs no longer scraping casually against the floor. She learned to read rooms the same way some people read weather, years of watching shoulders tense, hands curl around mugs, eyes drift toward exits. This felt like the moment right before a storm, when everything goes unnaturally still. Logan Prescott hadn't raised his voice yet. He didn't need to. Authority, when it's confident, rarely does. He stood rigid near the pastry case, clipboard tucked under one arm like a shield, finger extended toward Ray and Shadow as if pointing at a flaw in the structure itself. That animal, he said, each word clipped and precise, is a violation. Grace felt something stir low in her chest. Not anger, not fear, recognition. She felt this before, standing in hospital hallways waiting for updates that came too late, sitting through briefings filled with careful language meant to soften permanent loss. This was that same tone, the kind that pretends neutrality while quietly doing damage. She stepped out from behind the counter slowly. No sudden movements, no performance, just presence. "He's a registered service dog," she said, voice calm, steady. "Federal law permits him to be here." Prescott's eyes flicked toward the red vest, then away, dismissive. "State health code supersedes your personal interpretations. Animals carry risk." Across the room, Ray's grip tightened around his mug. Grace saw it, the whitening knuckles, the way his shoulders drew inward like he was bracing for impact. Shadow sensed it too, lifting his head slightly, eyes never leaving Ray's face. Trained, loyal still. Grace's heart ached, not loudly but deeply. She knew that posture, the way men like Ray folded into themselves when confronted, not because they were weak but because they were tired, tired of explaining, tired of proving they deserved space. "I won't ask him to leave," Grace said quietly. The words landed heavier than she expected. Prescott blinked, surprised, not by defiance but by the absence of apology. "Then you're choosing to risk closure." Grace didn't answer right away. She glanced around the cafe. At Ben Donnelly in the corner, pretending not to listen but missing nothing. At Louisa, lips pressed tight, eyes wet. At the chalkboard behind the counter announcing Hero's Hour in looping white letters. A promise she'd made and kept every week without fail. She thought of Michael, of how he used to say the hardest moments weren't the firefights, but the silences afterward, the ones where you decided who you were going to be. "I'm choosing not to humiliate a man who served this country," Grace said finally, "or the dog that keeps him standing." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Deborah Lyall's heels clicked against tile. Grace hadn't heard her come in. Maybe that was the point. Deborah always arrived like that, quietly, efficiently, eyes already calculating outcomes. Her expression now was unreadable, but her voice carried frost. "Grace Donnelly," she said, "you've just violated corporate policy in front of a state inspector." Grace turned. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. Somewhere deep inside she already knew. "Pack your things," Deborah continued. "You're done here." The words echoed, final and clean. Grace felt the room tilt, not spin, tilt, like the moment before balance gives way. She searched Deborah's face for something human, found none. So she nodded. She untied her apron slowly, fingers trembling now despite her efforts, folded it once, twice, placed it on the counter like an offering. She turned to Lena, who looked like she might cry or scream or both. "Make sure he gets his refill," Grace whispered. Then she walked out. The bell over the door jingled softly, unaware it had just marked an ending. Inside, no one moved. Ray stared at the spot where Grace had stood, his throat tight, guilt pressing hard against his ribs. He hadn't asked her to do this. He would have left. He always left. It was easier than being the reason someone else paid a price. Shadow nudged his knee gently. Outside, Grace stepped into sunlight that felt too normal. Birds chirped. Cars passed. Life continued, indifferent to the fracture that had just split her world in two. She made it to the side of the building before the first tear fell. Not loud, not dramatic, just one hot and heavy. She wiped it away quickly, not because she was ashamed, but because she refused to let this moment define her. Michael had taught her that. You don't control what happens. You control what you carry forward. She didn't know yet that someone inside had pressed record, that the quiet courage she thought unseen was already moving beyond the cafe walls. Inside, Lena poured Ray's coffee with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered, unsure who she was apologizing to. Ray shook his head slowly. She didn't do anything wrong. He stood then, joints stiff, and reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, left it on the table not as payment but as respect. As he walked toward the door, Prescott shifted uncomfortably. "Sir." Ray stopped, turned. "I've stood in worse places than this," he said evenly, "and I've learned something." Prescott swallowed. "The people who enforce rules without understanding them," Ray continued, "rarely understand what they destroy." He didn't wait for a response. Outside, Grace sat in her truck, hands resting uselessly in her lap. She stared through the windshield, replaying everything, wondering if she'd gone too far, if 6 years of building something had just evaporated because she couldn't stay silent. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She ignored it. Inside the cafe, time stretched thin. Customers whispered. Some left. Others stayed, stubborn, as if moving would somehow make Grace's absence permanent. Then the rumble began. Low at first, almost imagined. Lena felt it through the floor before she heard it, the subtle vibration of something large approaching. Glass rattled. A cup tipped slightly, sending a ripple across dark coffee. "What is that?" someone murmured. Ray paused mid-step outside, turning slowly. 4 military Humvees rolled into view. Grace's phone buzzed again. This time she answered. "Grace Donnelly," a calm voice said, measured, commanding. "This is Colonel Richard Gaines." Her breath caught. "I believe," he continued, "we need to talk." And somewhere between the cafe she'd lost and the purpose she hadn't yet found, Grace felt it, the unmistakable shift of a life about to be redefined. Why did the ground seem to tremble before anyone saw them, like the town itself sensed judgment arriving? Grace's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she pulled to the side of the road, her truck idling beneath a canopy of oak trees. The colonel's voice still echoed in her ears, steady, controlled, impossible to misread. He hadn't demanded. He hadn't explained. He'd simply said they needed to talk, and somehow that felt heavier than anger. She looked down at her palms, still faintly stained with coffee, still familiar, still hers. Everything else felt uncertain. Back at the cafe, the rumble grew louder, no longer subtle, no longer ignorable. It rolled through Mason like a distant storm moving closer with intention. People stepped toward the windows now, curiosity edging into unease. Someone pushed the blinds aside just enough to see. 4 military Humvees turned into the lot with disciplined precision, tires crunching against gravel, engines humming low and patient. Not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate. A hush fell so deep it felt like pressure. Doors opened in unison. Marines stepped out. Full-dress blues caught the morning light, sharp lines, polished brass, white gloves folded neatly in disciplined hands. They didn't fan out. They didn't posture. They simply formed up, shoulder to shoulder, presence alone commanding the space. Inside, Deborah Lyle took an unconscious step backward. Logan Prescott's clipboard lowered inch by inch, forgotten. Lena stood frozen behind the counter, heart pounding so hard she wondered if everyone could hear it. Then Colonel Richard Gaines emerged from the lead vehicle. He was tall but not imposing in the way movies portray power. His authority came from something quieter, history perhaps, loss. The kind of command earned by standing when others couldn't. He adjusted his gloves once, scanned the building not as a target but as a place where something important had happened. He entered alone. The bell over the door jingled softly, absurdly small against the weight that followed him inside. His boots struck the floor in slow, even steps, not hurried, not hesitant. Ray McMillan stood. The room noticed. Their eyes met. Years collapsed into a single look, recognition layered with respect. Ray straightened unconsciously, shoulders squaring, spine remembering what it meant to be seen by someone who understood. Colonel Gaines stopped in front of him and, without ceremony, raised his hand in a precise salute. Ray returned it. No one spoke. Prescott cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, I didn't realize." "You didn't need to," Gaines replied calmly, lowering his hand. "Dignity doesn't require identification." Silence swallowed the room again. Gaines turned slightly, addressing no one in particular. "Where is Grace Donnelly?" Lena swallowed hard. Her voice shook despite her effort. She was terminated for refusing to remove a veteran and his service dog. The colonel's jaw tightened, not in anger, in resolve. "That woman," he said evenly, "has done more for the families of this installation than most funded initiatives ever have." Deborah found her voice at last. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a corporate matter." Gaines turned his head just enough to look at her, not sharply, not dismissively, simply fully. "You made your decision," he said. "Now we'll make ours." Outside, he lifted one hand. That was all. Marines moved. Not fast, not slow, purposeful. Two stepped inside and carefully removed the corporate logo from the wall, peeling it away as if it were something sacred, folding it neatly, like a flag. Another Marine replaced the chalkboard sign near the counter with one brought from the vehicle. Hand-painted letters, white on black. Welcome to Grace's house. Honor is served here. A quiet gasp rippled through the cafe. Lena's phone buzzed. She looked down, confused, then up, eyes wide. It's from Fort Granger. They're requesting Grace Donnelly report to base headquarters, today. Ray exhaled slowly, something loosening in his chest. Shadow stood, tail giving one restrained wag. Across town, Grace sat gripping her phone, heart racing. I don't understand, she said softly into the receiver. I was just fired. Colonel Gaines' voice was steady. You were also just seen. She closed her eyes. For the first time since Michael's death, something unfamiliar stirred beneath the grief and routine. Possibility. Fort Granger rose ahead of her like a city of order, flag-lined avenues, clipped lawns, cadence calls echoing faintly from a distant training field. Grace parked and sat for a moment, breathing, grounding herself. She'd been here countless times as a military wife, bringing care packages, attending ceremonies, waiting. Walking in alone felt different. Colonel Gaines met her at the entrance. No entourage now, no ceremony, just a firm handshake and direct eye contact. Thank you for coming, he said. I didn't know what else to do, Grace replied honestly. He nodded. That's usually how the right paths begin. He led her through hallways lined with portraits, faces of commanders past, eyes steady, names etched in brass. They stopped in front of an unassuming door. Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. Inside, the room was unfinished. Folding chairs stacked against the wall, whiteboards half filled with ideas that had stalled, boxes of unused supplies, the quiet hum of a place waiting to matter. We've been trying to launch this for 2 years, Gaines said. On paper, it's sound. In practice, it's missing something. Grace folded her arms, uncertain. I'm not a therapist. I don't have credentials. No, he agreed, but you have something harder to teach. She looked at him, confused. You know how to make people stay, he said. Not because they're required to, but because they feel safe enough to. Before Grace could respond, a young woman stepped into the room, mid-20s, sleeves pulled down despite the heat, a service dog in training at her side. I saw the video, the woman said quietly. I haven't been able to sit in a cafe since I got back, but I think I could sit in a place you run. Grace felt her throat tighten. Her name was Tiffany Rios. And in that moment, Grace understood. This wasn't about losing a cafe. It was about being redirected. Colonel Gaines watched her carefully. We'd like you to run this center, not as a symbol, as a leader. Grace thought of the apron folded on the counter, of the chalkboard, of Ray and Shadow, of Michael's laugh over morning coffee. She nodded once. I'll do it. That night alone in the empty room, Grace pinned Michael's photo to the wall. No plaque, no frame, just memory and purpose. She stood back and whispered, barely audible, I'm still serving. And somewhere between loss and redemption, her new mission quietly began. What happens when healing doesn't arrive with answers, but with silence that finally feels safe? Grace learned quickly that the quiet inside the new center was different from the quiet in the cafe after closing. That silence had always felt earned, like the end of honest work. This one felt cautious, fragile, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see whether they could be trusted. The first morning she arrived before sunrise. Habit more than intention. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood still for a moment, listening. No clatter of cups, no bell over the door, just the low hum of the building settling into the day. She set her bag down and brewed a pot of coffee the same way she always had, measured, unhurried, respectful. She didn't put out signs. Didn't announce an opening. She simply made space. By 9 o'clock, one folding chair was occupied. A man sat with his back to the wall, hands clasped tightly between his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't introduce himself. Grace didn't ask. She poured him a cup of coffee and placed it on the table within reach, then sat across the room where he could see her without feeling watched. Minutes passed. Then more. Eventually he lifted the cup, sipped, exhaled. He didn't stay long, but he came back the next day. Word spread the same way it always had, with glances, with murmured reassurances, with the quiet courage of someone saying, "It wasn't bad." Veterans drifted in slowly, one at a time. Some stayed 5 minutes, some stayed an hour, some said nothing at all. Grace treated each visit the same. No pressure, no probing, just presence. She noticed patterns, the way certain people always chose seats near exits, the way others avoided eye contact until they'd mapped every corner of the room. She didn't rearrange the furniture to make it feel therapeutic. She left it human, imperfect, familiar. Tiffany Rios arrived on the third day. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, fingers curled tightly around the strap of her bag, the golden retriever puppy beside her shifting with quiet energy. The vest read "in training," the letters slightly crooked, as if stitched by someone still learning. Grace looked up from the notebook she'd brought from the cafe, the same one, worn at the edges, filled with names and small truths. "You don't have to come in," Grace said gently. "Standing there counts too." Tiffany swallowed, then nodded, took one step, then another. She chose a chair near the window, sunlight warming the scars she usually hid. Grace poured tea this time, remembering Tiffany's offhand comment days earlier. Chamomile, no sugar. That earned a look, brief, surprised. "You remembered," Tiffany said quietly. Grace shrugged. "I usually do." They didn't talk much that first day. Tiffany sketched instead, pencil moving in soft, deliberate strokes. Hands, dogs, a coffee cup steaming on a table. Grace watched without starring, recognizing the language of someone processing without words. Not everything went smoothly. By the second week, questions began to arrive from above. Emails written in careful tones, requests for documentation, metrics, outcomes. Grace read them all, then answered simply. Attendance numbers, return visits, notes about community engagement. She didn't embellish, didn't justify. Some days she left the center feeling hopeful. Other days she sat alone after closing, staring at the wall, wondering if she was out of her depth. The doubt crept in during those moments, quiet, insistent. Who am I to do this? She thought of Michael then, of how he'd once told her leadership wasn't about certainty, it was about staying when others walked away. Ray McMillan began coming regularly. He never announced himself, just appeared, shadow padding calmly beside him, heading straight for the same corner. Grace noticed how Ray's posture changed here, how his shoulders dropped a fraction, how his breathing slowed. He talked more now, not about combat, about the mundane things, the weather, the drive, the way Shadow liked to sleep with one paw touching his boot. One afternoon, Ray lingered after everyone else had gone. "You know," he said, eyes on the floor, "I almost didn't come back after that day at the cafe." Grace nodded. "I figured. I thought I was the problem," he admitted, "that wherever I went things fell apart." Grace leaned back in her chair. "Things fall apart all the time," she said. "That doesn't mean you're the cause." Ray was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, like someone filing that thought away for later. The first official review came without warning. 3 auditors arrived in pressed suits, clipboards in hand, expressions polite but guarded. They asked Grace about her qualifications, her methods, her long-term goals. She answered honestly. "I don't treat trauma," she said. "I make room for it." One of the auditors frowned slightly. "And you believe that's sufficient?" Grace met his gaze. "I believe it's a start." They observed silently for hours, watched interactions, noted who spoke and who didn't, who stayed and who left. When they finally departed, they offered no feedback. That night Grace sat alone in her office, the doubt heavier than usual. The walls felt too bare, the responsibility too large. She took out Michael's watch and held it in her palm, grounding herself in its familiar weight. "I'm trying," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope it's enough." The following week, the center received its first letter of support. Then another. Then a call. A regional coordinator wanted to visit. A pilot expansion was being discussed. Grace listened, heart pounding, and agreed to nothing she couldn't deliver. "I won't turn this into something it's not," she said firmly. "Good," the voice on the other end replied. "That's why we're calling." The day the local paper showed up, Grace almost sent them away. She hated the idea of spectacle, of turning pain into a headline, but Ray surprised her. "Let them see," he said quietly. "Not for you, for the ones who don't know this place exists yet." So she agreed. The article was simple. No grand claims. Just a photograph of the room, dogs curled under chairs, coffee cups on tables, sunlight spilling across a space that looked ordinary until you understood what it held. From Cafe to Command, the headline read. Grace didn't frame it. One afternoon she returned to the Mason mug without telling anyone. Habit again. The bell jingled. The smell of coffee hit her like memory. Lena stood behind the counter. "Well," she said, grinning, "look who decided to visit the civilians." Grace laughed softly. "I needed a cup of coffee." The cafe had changed. Photos lined the walls now. Veterans, families. A small sign near the window read, "Grace's Corner, no one sits alone." Grace swallowed hard. Ray's photo was there, Tiffany's sketch framed and hung, Shadow asleep under a table. Lena slid a mug across the counter, "On the house." Grace wrapped her hands around it, warmth seeping in. For the first time since being fired, she felt no bitterness, just gratitude. That night back at the center, Grace added another photo to the wall, not of herself, of the cafe, of the place that had taught her how to lead without realizing it. She stepped back, arms crossed, taking it all in. The center was still imperfect, still fragile, but it was alive. And as the door opened and another hesitant figure stepped inside, Grace straightened, offered a gentle smile, and did what she'd always done best. She made room. Why did recognition feel heavier than loss? Like being seen meant there was no place left to hide. Grace didn't expect the letter to arrive the way it did. No fanfare, no call ahead. Just a plain envelope waiting on her desk when she unlocked the center one quiet morning, the seal pressed clean and official. She stared at it longer than necessary, fingers resting on the edge as if it might be warm. Somewhere in her chest, instinct whispered that opening it would change the shape of things. She made coffee first. That had become her ritual when uncertainty pressed too close. Brew, pour, breathe. Only then did she sit and slide a finger beneath the flap. The language inside was formal, precise. Nominations, civilian commendation, distinguished service to veterans. Words that felt too large, too polished to belong to a woman who still wiped tables herself and carried spare leashes in her bag just in case. She read it twice, then a third time. "I didn't do anything special," she murmured to the empty room. The walls didn't argue, but memory did. Faces flickered through her mind. Ray standing a little taller. Tiffany sketching again. The man who came every Thursday just to sit and leave without speaking. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, as if containing it might also contain what it represented. Colonel Gaines called an hour later. "You got the letter," he said, not asking. Grace smiled faintly. "I did." "They want you in Washington," he continued. "Conference, ceremony, speech." Her smile faded. "That's a mistake." Gaines chuckled softly. so was thinking you were just a cafe manager." She exhaled slowly. "I don't like being on stages." "You're not being asked to perform," he replied. "You're being asked to speak." There was a difference. Grace understood that. Still, the idea unsettled her. Being visible meant expectations, scrutiny, the possibility of failing in front of people who believed. "I'll think about it," she said. After the call, Grace sat quietly, staring at the wall of photos. Michael's smile looked back at her from his unframed picture, familiar and steady. She imagined what he'd say, probably something simple, something annoying and true. "Don't shrink now." Ray arrived later that afternoon, Shadow trotting beside him, tail giving its usual restrained wag. He noticed the envelope on Grace's desk immediately. "That look," he said, nodding toward her face. "That's a big one." She hesitated, then handed it to him. Ray read slowly, carefully. When he finished, he didn't smile, he didn't joke. "They're right," he said finally. Grace tilted her head. "About what?" "About you," he replied. "You don't see it because you're standing in the middle of it." She leaned back, folding her arms. "I never asked for any of this." Ray nodded. "Neither did most of us." The words landed gently, but they stayed. Tiffany overheard part of the conversation from across the room. She approached hesitantly, sketchbook tucked against her chest. "You're going to Washington?" she asked. "Maybe," Grace said. Tiffany's eyes lit up, not with excitement but with something quieter. Relief, maybe. That means people will listen. Grace looked at her then, really looked, at the steadier posture, the less guarded eyes, at the puppy now lying calmly at Tiffany's feet, training vest slightly askew. "That's what scares me," Grace admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing?" Tiffany smiled faintly. "You didn't before." That settled it more than any letter could. The trip came faster than Grace expected. She packed light. One blazer, sensible shoes, Michael's watch, and the notebook, the same one she'd carried for years, filled with names and notes that no one else would understand. It weighed more than everything else combined. At the airport, she felt small again, out of place. A woman among uniforms and purpose, her own role undefined. She found a quiet seat near the window and opened the notebook, grounding herself in familiar handwriting. "Grace Donnelly." She looked up. Ray stood there in full dress blues, posture straight, expression almost shy. Shadow sat at his side, calm as ever. "They assigned me as your escort," Ray said, a hint of a grin breaking through. "Apparently, I'm good for optics." Grace laughed despite herself. "You clean up well." "So do you," he replied, nodding toward her blazer. "Ready." She was, but she stood anyway. Washington felt overwhelming at first. The scale, the noise, the way everything seemed designed to impress. Grace stuck close to Ray, grateful for his steady presence. He navigated the halls and corridors with practiced ease, pointing out quiet corners when she needed air. The conference ballroom was larger than Grace had imagined. White tablecloths, soft lighting, a stage framed by flags. Her name glowed on the screen behind the podium in elegant letters. She swallowed hard. "You don't have to be perfect," Ray murmured beside her. "Just be honest." When her name was called, the applause startled her. It rolled through the room like a wave, lifting her whether she was ready or not. Grace stepped onto the stage, heart pounding, hands slightly unsteady. She gripped the podium. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, not awkward but attentive. She took a breath. "I'm not a general," she began, voice quieter than the room but steady. "I'm not a doctor. I didn't write policy or lead troops." A few heads tilted. The room leaned in. "I managed a cafe near a military base," she continued. "I served coffee. I listened." She paused, letting that settle. "And in that space, I watched something sacred happen. Veterans didn't come to be fixed. They came to be seen." Faces softened. A few people nodded. One day, I got fired for letting a man sit with his service dog, Grace said. That was the moment everything changed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed something we forget too easily. Her hands steadied now. Dignity isn't complicated. It just requires consistency. The applause came slowly at first, then all at once. Grace didn't see Ray clap. He didn't. He stood at the back, hands folded, nodding once, like a soldier receiving orders he finally understood. Later that evening, after the ceremony, Grace stepped outside alone. The city hummed around her, distant and indifferent. She needed air, space. "You don't remember me, do you?" She turned to see an older man, gray hair neatly combed, eyes kind behind thin glasses. He held a photograph, edges worn. Grace took it, heart stuttering. It was the cafe, years ago. Michael stood outside, laughing, arms slung around a man in uniform. "You poured me a cup of coffee the day I got my medical discharge," the man said softly. "You didn't say anything, you just smiled." Grace's throat closed. "That was the first time I felt like myself again," he continued. "I thought you should have this." She couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears blurring her vision as she accepted the photo. Back in Mason days later, the town planned a welcome celebration. Balloons, speeches, gratitude layered thick. Grace thanked them but slipped away early. She returned to the center instead. The building was quiet, lit softly. A few veterans lingered near the fire pit outside, voices low. Grace walked to the wall of photos and added two more. One from the conference, applause frozen in time. One of the cafe, Michael smiling. Beneath them, she wrote a simple line. "Honor grows where kindness is consistent." As she turned to leave, the door opened. A young man stood there, eyes nervous, hands clenched. Is this the place for people like me?" he asked. Grace smiled gently. "No," she said, "this is the place for people like all of us." And in that moment, she understood something fully at last. Being seen wasn't the end of her mission. It was the responsibility to keep showing up. Why did the quiet feel different now? Not empty, not heavy, but full, like something had finally settled where it belonged. Grace stood alone in the center long after the last light outside had dimmed. The building no longer felt unfinished. It still bore scuffed floors and mismatched chairs, but there was weight in the air now. The kind that comes from lives intersecting, from stories staying instead of passing through. She moved slowly along the wall of photographs, fingertips brushing the edges, not counting them, just acknowledging them. This place had stopped feeling temporary. She remembered the cafe in its early days, how she'd worried no one would come, how she'd learned that the people who needed it most often arrived last, quietly, testing the ground before committing their weight. This was the same. Healing didn't announce itself. It arrived cautiously, asking permission. Outside, laughter drifted in from the fire pit. Low, uneven, real. Grace paused by the window and watched. Ray sat slightly apart from the others, shadow stretched out beside him, head resting on his boot. Tiffany was there too, sketchbook balanced on her knee, the puppy finally asleep at her feet after a long day of training. She wasn't hiding her arms tonight. The scars were still there, but they no longer seemed to define the space around her. Grace felt a familiar ache in her chest. Not grief this time, something softer, pride maybe, or relief. Colonel Gaines had warned her that success would bring new pressures, oversight, expansion, requests to replicate what she'd built. They'd already begun, emails from other bases, other towns, people wanting a blueprint. She never sent one. Instead, she replied with the same message every time. Start by listening. Stay longer than is comfortable. Don't rush the quiet. Some understood, some didn't. Grace had stopped trying to convince anyone. She learned that the people meant to hear her would. The center grew, but it didn't swell. No banners, no slogans, just more chairs filled, more names added to the notebook, More moments that didn't look like progress from the outside but meant everything to the people living them. One evening, Ray stayed behind after everyone else left. "You ever think about slowing down?" he asked, half smiling. Grace raised an eyebrow. "You mean stopping?" He shrugged. "You've done enough." She considered that, thought of the mornings she still arrived early, of the nights she left late, of how tired she sometimes felt, not physically, but emotionally, like she was carrying fragments of other people's pain home with her. "I think about it," she admitted. "Then someone walks through that door." Ray nodded. "Yeah, that'll do it." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A patch, faded, Marine Recon. "I never told you," he said quietly, "but I almost didn't make it back from my last deployment, not because of injuries." Grace waited. "Because I didn't see a place for myself anymore," he finished. "The cafe helped. This place kept me." Her throat tightened. "You kept yourself," she said gently. Ray shook his head. "You made it possible." He left the patch on her desk and walked out without ceremony. Grace sat with it for a long time. Later that night, she took Michael's watch out of her bag. It no longer felt like something she carried to survive. It felt like something she carried to remember where she'd come from. She thought of the promise she'd made at Arlington, not to let grief turn her away from the world. She'd kept it. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but faithfully. Weeks passed, then months. The story of the cafe faded from headlines, replaced by new moments, new crises. Grace was grateful for that. Stories like hers weren't meant to be held up forever. They were meant to point somewhere, then step aside. One afternoon she received a handwritten letter, no letterhead, no seal. It was from Lena. The Mason mug had changed ownership again. Quietly, a group of veterans and families had pooled resources, turned it into a cooperative. They kept the sign Grace's house. They kept Hero's Hour. They kept the corner by the window where Ray used to sit. Grace folded the letter carefully and smiled. That evening she drove out to the edge of town, to a small hill overlooking Mason. She'd come here before when the weight of things felt too heavy. She sat on the hood of her truck, watching the sky deepen into dusk. She talked to Michael then, not out loud, just the way she always had. "I didn't plan any of this," she thought, "but I think you'd understand." The wind moved through the trees softly, like an answer that didn't need words. Back at the center, a new face appeared at the door. Older, hesitant, a man who stood too straight, like relaxing was still dangerous. Grace greeted him the same way she greeted everyone. "No rush," she said. "You can sit wherever feels right." He chose a chair near the wall. Shadow lifted his head briefly, then settled again. The man exhaled just a fraction. Grace poured coffee. She didn't ask his name, not yet. Later, as she locked up for the night, Grace paused under the sign at the entrance. Veteran Transition and Wellness Initiative. She considered it, then taped a smaller card beneath it, handwritten, slightly crooked. "You don't have to be fixed to belong here." She stepped back and nodded once. The world outside moved fast, loud, demanding. It rewarded certainty and spectacle, but inside these walls something else lived, something slower, steadier, harder to measure. Grace had learned that strength didn't always arrive with confidence. Sometimes it arrived trembling, asking for a chair and a cup of coffee. Sometimes it arrived on four legs, trained to sense panic before words formed. Sometimes it arrived wearing grief so quietly no one noticed unless they looked closely. She turned off the lights and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the building settle. Once she'd been fired for refusing to turn someone away. That choice had cost her a job. It had given her a mission. Grace Donnelly never wore rank. She never carried a weapon, but she understood service in its purest form, the kind that asks nothing in return, the kind that stays when it would be easier to leave. In a world quick to measure worth by titles and authority, She chose something quieter. She chose dignity. And sometimes, dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. Sometimes dignity simply opens the door, pours the coffee, and makes room. And that is how lives begin to heal.